Some people think a gate is just a suggestion. That's what Rebecca Holloway liked to say at HOA meetings, usually with that polished smile and a paper cup of lukewarm coffee in her hand. At 7:43 a.m. on a clear Monday morning, her white Lexus SUV proved exactly what she meant when it came barreling down my gravel drive like it owned the place. The sound hit first, a low engine growl rolling over 60 acres of Texas pasture. Then the crunch of tires chewing through limestone rock I'd paid for by the ton. I was already standing by the fence line, coffee cooling in my palm, because I knew she'd try again. The air smelled like dew and diesel, and somewhere behind me my horses shifted uneasy in the pasture. She didn't slow down. She never did. The old wooden ranch gate I built with my father 15 years ago used to swing smooth as a church door. Solid cedar. Steel hinges rated for livestock trailers. The first time she drove through it, she claimed she thought it was community overflow access. The second time, she said the latch must have been faulty. By the third time, the hinges were twisted and the latch plate hung loose like a broken tooth. I replaced it twice, installed cameras, filed reports. Each time she smiled and said the same thing. We all share responsibility for access roads. Access roads. That word hung in the air heavier than august humidity. This land has been in my family since 1974. 60 acres of fenced pasture, one weathered barn, a mile-long private drive cutting through oak and mesquite. My deed is clear. No easement. No right-of-way. Just dirt, wire, and the quiet my father used to call freedom. But Rebecca was HOA president of the new subdivision carved out along my south fence line. 37 beige houses where cattle used to graze. She ran that cul-de-sac like a suburban mayor, armed with bylaws and a Bluetooth headset. She decided my gravel drive would be the shortcut to their community nature trail. She sent emails, posted maps, even had a printed flyer once that labeled my property as future shared access. I kept every copy, every timestamp, every tire track pressed into soft soil after a rain. What she didn't know was that 6 months ago, after the fourth busted hinge and the fifth misunderstanding, I stopped arguing. I started measuring depth, clearance, impact rating. I spent 20 years in commercial construction before I came back to run cattle. I know what steel can handle. I know what 4,000 pounds of moving vehicle does at 15 miles per hour. And I know the difference between revenge and reinforcement. When her SUV reached the mouth of the drive that morning, the sun caught the top of the new steel bollards I'd set in 12-inch concrete footings 3 feet below grade. Powder-coated black. DOT rated. Fully permitted. Legal as sunrise. She pressed the gas like she always did, expecting wood to give way. Instead, there was a dull metallic thud that echoed across the pasture and a sudden stillness that followed. The engine cut. The birds scattered. Dust drifted through the morning light. I took a slow sip of cold coffee and watched the steam rise off her hood. Some gates don't swing anymore. Some just stand their ground. Rebecca did not get out of the vehicle right away. The engine ticked as it cooled, a faint metallic clicking that carried across the pasture like a nervous habit. I could see her silhouette through the windshield, perfectly still, both hands locked on the steering wheel. The front bumper rested against the steel bollard like it had just discovered something it did not understand. No splintered wood. No broken hinge. Just immovable black steel anchored 3 feet into Texas clay. I set my coffee down on the fence post and walked toward the drive, boots pressing into gravel with a slow, deliberate crunch. The morning sun was climbing over the oak trees, throwing long shadows that stretched from the posts across her hood. Up close, I could see the confusion settling in behind her tinted glass. She finally opened the door, carefully, as if the air outside might accuse her. The smell of warm coolant and fresh dust hung between us. She adjusted her sunglasses and looked at the bollards first, not at me. 3 of them, spaced exactly 48 inches apart. Enough room for a pickup with permission. Not enough for someone who assumed the rules did not apply. You cannot obstruct a shared access road, she said, her voice tight, but still rehearsed. I had heard that tone before at board meetings. Calm, certain, used to being agreed with. I stopped about 10 feet away, hands in my pockets. This is a private agricultural driveway, I said evenly. County recorded. No easement. No right-of-way. She glanced back at her SUV, then at the steel posts again, as if hoping they might retract out of courtesy. They did not move. A breeze slid across the pasture, carrying the dry scent of hay and sun-warmed cedar. 6 months earlier, I stood in the county clerk's office with a copy of my original deed from 1974 spread across a laminate counter. The paper was yellowed at the edges, but clear as day. Parcel boundaries marked in ink. No shared designation. No community corridor. I paid for a fresh survey anyway. Paid for stamped documents. Filed them. Quietly. Rebecca never bothered checking county records. She relied on subdivision maps printed in glossy brochures handed out at open houses. Maps that showed my gravel drive as a faint dotted line labeled Future Connectivity. Future does not override present. Assumptions do not override ink. You should have notified the association, she said, chin lifting slightly. We have residents who depend on this access. Depend. The word echoed strangely against 60 acres of open land that had never depended on anything but rain. I let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of it to settle. A hawk circled overhead. Somewhere near the barn, a gate chain tapped softly in the wind. Your residents have a paved entrance on Willow Creek Road, I replied. 2 lanes. Proper signage. That is their access. She looked past me toward the pasture, perhaps searching for sympathy in the grass. What she found instead were fence lines running straight and unbroken all the way to the tree line. She pulled out her phone, probably already drafting a message to the board, to the neighborhood group chat, to anyone who would listen. I had expected that too. Every conversation, every complaint, every claim that I was being unreasonable. I had saved them all. Steel does not argue. It does not explain. It simply holds. And that morning, standing there under a wide Texas sky, I realized something important. She had spent months trying to turn my property into a suggestion. All I had done was remind it how to stand still. Rebecca did not argue much longer that morning. She stood there with her phone in her hand, eyes flicking between the steel posts and the faint reflection of herself in the tinted window of her SUV, as if she was trying to calculate how this scene would look when retold at the next board meeting. The wind pushed a strand of hair loose from her neat ponytail, and for a split second, she looked less like a president of anything and more like someone who had simply misjudged the distance between assumption and reality. She stepped back from the bumper and crouched slightly, inspecting the base of the nearest bollard. 12 inches of reinforced concrete collar visible above grade, smooth and clean, still light gray against the reddish soil. She tapped it lightly with her knuckles. Solid. No wobble. No give. I could almost hear the math running behind her sunglasses. You cannot just put industrial equipment in a residential corridor, she said finally, brushing dust from her slacks. Residential corridor. I'll let the phrase sit there. Behind me, 60 acres of pasture stretched out under a wide blue sky, fence line straight as a ruler, a weathered barn sitting quiet a quarter-mile back. This is zoned agricultural, I said calmly. County permit number is on file. Inspected last Thursday. I had made sure of that. When the inspector drove out, he walked the entire driveway with me, measured the spacing, checked the depth of the footings. He nodded once and said, "Looks compliant." That word matters. Compliant. It does not shout. It does not threaten. It simply stands in the record. Rebecca straightened and opened her car door again, carefully this time, easing it shut as though sudden movements might make the steel multiply. She circled around to the front and studied the narrow gap between the posts. 48 inches, center to center. Enough for a ranch truck with a mirror fold. Not enough for a full-size sport utility vehicle approaching at speed. She glanced up at the camera mounted on the cedar post beside the drive. The small red light was steady, patient. I watched her notice it. "You are recording this?" she asked. 24 hours a day, I replied. Audio and video. That had been another quiet investment. Not to intimidate. To document. 6 months ago, when she first began telling residents that my drive was a community shortcut, I started saving everything. Emails. Meeting minutes. Screenshots of the subdivision map with my property faintly shaded in as if it were already absorbed. I never responded publicly. I did not need to. Paper trails grow stronger when left undisturbed. A pickup truck rolled past on Willow Creek Road in the distance, the actual paved entrance to her subdivision, sunlight flashing off its windshield. 2 lanes. Proper signage. Maintained by the county. The road her residents were supposed to use. Rebecca followed the sound with her eyes, and then looked back at the steel posts blocking her front bumper. For the first time since I had known her, she did not have a prepared sentence ready. The silence between us felt different now. Not tense, just settled, like dust after a storm. She walked back to the driver's seat, started the engine, and carefully reversed down the gravel drive she had once treated like a personal driveway. Tires rolled slower this time, more deliberate. When she reached the county road, she paused, glanced in her rearview mirror toward the black posts standing in the sun, and then turned left toward the entrance she had always had. I stayed where I was, listening to the fading hum of her engine. The pasture exhaled. A gate chain clinked softly in the breeze. And for the first time in months, the only thing moving across my driveway was the wind. By noon, the neighborhood message board was already humming. I did not need to check it to know that my name was sitting in bold letters somewhere between complaints about lawn height and lost packages. Rebecca had a talent for turning inconvenience into a public safety concern. Around 1:30 that afternoon, a white sedan with the Willowbrook Estates logo on the door eased up to the county road entrance of my property. It did not turn into my drive. It stopped at the shoulder instead. Two men in polo shirts stepped out, clipboards tucked under their arms, sunglasses reflecting the Texas sun. They stood there studying the steel posts from a distance like archaeologists observing something ancient and suspicious. I watched from the shade of the barn, the smell of cut hay lingering in the air. They did not cross the fence line. That told me everything. They knew. One of them pointed toward the posts and shook his head slightly. The other made a note on his clipboard. Then they both got back in the sedan and drove away toward the subdivision entrance. Paper moves slower than engines, but it carries more weight. I spent the rest of the afternoon repairing a section of fence near the north pasture, the steady rhythm of a hammer driving staples into cedar posts calming in a way emails never could. Around 4 o'clock, my phone buzzed in my pocket. An official-looking message from the Homeowners Association. Subject line, Notice of Obstruction and Community Impact. I wiped sweat from my forehead with the back of my glove and opened it. The language was polished. Formal. They claimed the newly installed steel barriers interfered with planned pedestrian connectivity between the subdivision and surrounding green spaces. Green spaces. That was what they were calling my cattle pasture now. I read the message twice, slow and deliberate, tasting the faint bitterness of sun and dust on my tongue. There was no citation of a recorded easement. No reference to county statute. Just phrases like community integration and shared vision. I closed the message and walked back toward the driveway. The steel posts stood exactly where they had that morning, shadows shortening as the sun tilted west. I ran my hand across the cool powder-coated surface. Solid. Compliant. Inspected. 6 months earlier, when I first heard residents cutting across my land on weekend afternoons, I did not react. I watched. I documented tire tracks pressed into soft soil after rain. I photographed footprints near the stock pond. I printed screenshots of neighborhood newsletters that described my property as an upcoming amenity corridor. Each detail went into a folder in my desk drawer labeled Simply Property. I had learned in construction that you do not argue with speculation. You answer it with measurements. That evening, as the sky shifted from bright blue to a muted orange, another vehicle approached slowly down the county road. This time it was a sheriff cruiser. The deputy parked along the shoulder and stepped out, hat low against the sun. He nodded once in my direction before walking toward the fence. The air felt steady, almost expectant. Paper had moved, and now authority had followed. The sheriff stepped up to the fence line with the slow confidence of someone who has seen every version of neighbor disputes a county can offer. His boots pressed into the gravel at the edge of my drive, the late afternoon sun catching the silver badge on his chest. "Afternoon, Ethan," he said, voice steady and neutral. The smell of sun-baked dust and warm metal still hung in the air from earlier. I nodded once and walked over, wiping my hands on a work rag. Behind him, the subdivision roofs shimmered in the distance, identical slopes lined up like dominoes. "Got a call about restricted community access," he continued, glancing toward the steel posts. His eyes moved from the bollards to the fence, then out across the pasture that rolled wide and uninterrupted for acres. Nothing about it suggested a public corridor. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a folded copy of my property survey, laminated at the edges from use. "This driveway sits entirely within parcel boundary," I said calmly. "No recorded easement. County confirmed last month." He took the paper, studied the lines, the measurements, the official stamp in the corner. The only sound was wind brushing through dry grass and the faint hum of insects rising with the heat. After a long moment, he handed the survey back. "Looks straightforward," he said. "Private agricultural access." That word again. Private. It carried more authority than any neighborhood newsletter ever could. He turned slightly, scanning the steel posts with a professional eye. "Installed properly?" he asked. "Permitted and inspected," I replied. "Depth, 3 feet. Reinforced concrete footing. Compliant spacing." He nodded once, as if mentally checking boxes. Across the county road, I noticed a familiar white SUV parked just beyond the subdivision entrance. Rebecca sat behind the wheel, engine idling, watching the exchange from a safe distance. Even from there, I could feel her expectation, like she believed the badge would tilt in her favor. The deputy followed my line of sight and gave a small, almost imperceptible sigh. "Ma'am called it in as a hazard," he said quietly. "Claimed residents were being blocked from established access." I let the silence answer for a second before speaking. "There has never been established access." He gave another nod. "That is what the records show." He adjusted his hat and stepped back toward his cruiser. Before getting in, he turned once more. "You are within your rights," he said simply. "If anyone attempts to damage or bypass those barriers, call it in. No drama. No raised voices. Just fact layered on fact." The cruiser pulled away, gravel crunching under its tires as it merged onto the county road. Rebecca's SUV lingered for another few seconds, then slowly eased forward, passing the entrance without turning in. The engine note faded toward the proper subdivision gate. I stood there a while longer, the steel posts casting long shadows across the drive as the sun dipped lower. Paper had spoken. Authority had confirmed it. And the only thing left between my ranch and the outside world was 3 quiet pillars of steel, rooted deeper than anyone in that subdivision had bothered to check. The next morning arrived quiet, but quiet in Texas does not mean peaceful. It means something is thinking. I woke before sunrise, stepped out onto the porch with a mug of black coffee, and let the early air settle into my lungs. It smelled like damp soil and cut grass, the kind of scent that makes you believe land remembers who takes care of it. The steel posts stood at the end of the drive, silhouettes against a pale orange sky, unbothered by whatever had brewed overnight in subdivision group chats. At 8:15, my phone buzzed. A certified email from the Homeowners Association attorney. The tone had shifted. No more talk of green space connectivity. Now it was about liability exposure and potential nuisance claims. They argued that emergency services might require access through my property in the event of unforeseen circumstances. I read it slowly, twice, leaning against the porch railing while cattle moved lazily near the fence line. Emergency services already had mapped routes through the subdivision entrance on Willow Creek Road. I knew that because I had checked with the county planning office 2 weeks before installing the posts. Fire department clearance radius. Ambulance routing. Everything documented. Anticipation is a quiet advantage. Around mid-morning, a white utility truck bearing the county seal rolled down Willow Creek Road and stopped at the subdivision entrance. 2 officials stepped out and walked the paved lanes, measuring distances, checking signage. Word travels fast when lawyers start sending letters. By noon, Rebecca's SUV appeared again at the county road intersection. This time she did not attempt to turn into my drive. She parked on the shoulder and stepped out, phone pressed to her ear, pacing in small, controlled circles. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the tightness in her posture. Not anger. Calculation. The sun climbed higher, reflecting sharply off the black powder coating of the bollards. They were not dramatic. They were not decorative. They were simply there. Around 1 o'clock, the county truck pulled up beside my fence. One of the officials approached, clipboard in hand, and asked if he could confirm the permit numbers posted near the drive. I walked him through the paperwork again, the edges of the documents warm from sitting in my truck's dashboard folder. He compared serial numbers, nodded once, and made a notation. "All appears compliant," he said. That word again. Compliant. It settled heavier than any accusation ever had. Rebecca ended her call and stood still for a long moment, staring at the steel posts that refused to bend to narrative. When she finally drove off, she did not look in my direction. She merged onto Willow Creek Road and followed the proper entrance into her subdivision like every other resident. I stood by the fence and listened to the fading hum of traffic. The wind brushed across the pasture, bending tall grass in slow waves. 6 months of quiet preparation had come down to this simple truth. Land does not answer to assumptions. It answers to records. And the deeper something is set into concrete, the less it cares about opinion. 3 days passed without a single tire touching my gravel. That was how I knew something else was coming. Silence from people who thrive on control is never surrender. It is strategy. On Thursday evening, just as the sun dipped low enough to turn the pasture gold, a black pickup rolled slowly down Willow Creek Road and stopped near my fence. 2 members of the Homeowners Association board stepped out, the same polo shirts, the same clipped expressions. They did not approach the driveway this time. They stood on the county's shoulder, pointing toward the steel posts, measuring with their eyes instead of tape. I stayed where I was near the barn, leaning against the wooden frame, listening to the distant murmur of their conversation carried by the wind. The air smelled like warm cedar and faint gasoline from their idling engine. After a few minutes, one of them raised a phone and took pictures. Documentation. I almost smiled. I had been documenting for months. Let them catch up. The following morning, a certified envelope arrived in my mailbox. Thick paper. Legal letterhead. I opened it at the kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator steady in the background. The association was filing a formal petition with the county claiming historical implied access based on repeated community use. Historical implied access. That phrase was almost impressive in its creativity. Repeated use does not become a right simply because someone repeats it loudly. 6 months earlier, when I first noticed increased traffic cutting across my land, I had placed temporary wooden stakes along the edge of the drive and photographed them daily. I saved footage of vehicles bypassing the closed gate. I time-stamped every instance of entry. Implied access cannot grow where objection has been recorded. By noon, I was back at the county clerk's office, boots echoing on tile floors, sliding a stack of printed images across the counter. The clerk adjusted her glasses and flipped through the pages, noting dates, times, visible gate closures. "You have consistent evidence of restricted entry," she said matter-of-factly. I nodded once. Outside, heat shimmered off the parking lot asphalt. Across town, Rebecca was likely drafting her next message, framing this as stubbornness or obstruction. She had built a narrative around inevitability, around the idea that development absorbs everything in its path. But inevitability does not erase boundary lines drawn in ink. Late that afternoon, I walked the length of my fence line, checking posts, tightening wire, listening to the rhythmic creak of metal stretching in the heat. The steel bollards cast long shadows again, unbothered by petitions or board meetings. A hawk traced slow circles overhead. The subdivision beyond my south fence looked smaller from this angle, rooftops barely peeking above tree lines. Progress can feel loud when it is close. From a distance, it is just another cluster of structures under the same sky. My phone buzzed once more near sunset. A notification from the county portal. The petition had been received. Review pending. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and watched the light fade from orange to deep blue across 60 acres that had never belonged to anyone but my family. If they wanted to argue history, I was ready to show them the whole record. The county review moved faster than the Homeowners Association expected. By Tuesday morning, a formal notice was posted on the public records portal stating that no historical easement existed on my parcel and that repeated unauthorized use did not establish legal access. The language was clean and precise, the kind that leaves no room for interpretation. I read it standing in the shade of my truck, the smell of sun-heated vinyl mixing with dry pasture air. 6 months of quiet documentation had just become official record. Around 10:30, a small crowd gathered at the subdivision entrance. I could see them from the ridge near my north fence line. Rebecca stood in front of the group, holding printed copies of something, gesturing toward my property with sharp, controlled movements. Even from a distance, I recognized the posture of someone trying to hold authority together with volume. By noon, her SUV rolled down Willow Creek Road again, slower this time. She stopped near my fence, but did not step out immediately. The engine idled for a long moment before finally cutting off. When she opened the door, the wind carried a faint scent of expensive perfume and warm asphalt. She walked toward the fence line, but did not cross it. The county denied the petition. she said without greeting. Her voice was tight, stripped of its usual polish. They reviewed documented objections and permit filings. I replied evenly. There is no shared corridor. She looked past me toward the steel posts standing quiet at the mouth of the drive. For a second, something flickered across her face that was not anger and not defiance. It was realization. She had built her argument on repetition, on momentum, on the assumption that development eventually absorbs resistance. What she ran into was paper. Stamped. Filed. Dated. She exhaled slowly and folded the documents in her hand. The board will be reviewing internal procedures, she said, almost to herself. Internal procedures. That was how organizations describe retreat. In the following days, word spread through the subdivision that access through my property had never been authorized. A revised community map was posted online with my parcel clearly marked as private agricultural land. The faint dotted line that once suggested connectivity disappeared. The steel posts remained exactly where they had been, casting the same measured shadows across gravel. No one approached them anymore. No vehicles tested their spacing. Even weekend foot traffic stopped at the fence line and turned back toward the proper entrance. One evening, as the sun settled low and turned the pasture copper, a different vehicle pulled up along Willow Creek Road. Not Rebecca. A moving truck backed into her driveway 2 houses inside the subdivision. I watched from a distance as furniture was carried out piece by piece. Power shifts quietly. Titles change. Sometimes people do too. I did not celebrate. I did not comment. I simply walked the length of my fence at dusk, listening to the steady hum of insects rising from the grass. The land had not changed. The posts had not moved. What changed was the narrative. And once that shifted, everything else followed. 2 weeks later, the pasture felt different, not because anything physical had changed, but because the tension had drained out of the air. Mornings went back to sounding like wind moving through wire and cattle shifting near the fence line instead of engines testing boundaries. I would step onto the porch before sunrise, coffee warming my hands, and watch the first lights stretch across 60 acres that had stood long before any subdivision brochure ever printed a dotted line through it. The steel posts remained exactly where I had set them, black powder coat still clean, concrete collars cured solid and unmoving. They were not monuments. They were not trophies. They were measurements made visible. The subdivision to the south adjusted quietly. A new interim president was elected according to a notice posted on their website. Language changed from expansion and integration to maintenance and compliance. The revised community map kept my parcel clearly shaded and labeled private agricultural land, bold enough that no one could pretend not to see it again. On Saturday afternoons, I noticed something almost amusing. Families walking along their paved sidewalks would stop at the edge of their boundary fence and look out across my pasture like it was scenery instead of opportunity. Children pointed at cattle. Parents read the small county sign I had installed near the drive that stated private property, no public access. The words were simple. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They simply existed in plain English. One evening, as the sun dropped low and turned the sky a deep Texas orange, I walked down the gravel drive toward the road. The crunch under my boots sounded steady and unchallenged. I ran my hand along one of the steel posts, feeling the cool surface against calloused fingers. 6 months of preparation had never been about stopping a vehicle. It had been about drawing a line that matched what the deed already said. Paper, permits, inspection stamps, timestamps, photographs. None of it dramatic. All of it deliberate. A hawk traced a slow circle overhead, shadow gliding across pasture grass. In the distance, traffic moved along Willow Creek Road exactly where it was meant to. The subdivision entrance sign stood clean and polished, directing residents toward the route that had always been theirs. No one approached my drive anymore. No one tested the spacing between the posts. Boundaries, once confirmed, tend to settle into routine. That night, I sat on the porch long after the light faded, listening to crickets build their steady rhythm in the dark. The land felt the way my father used to describe it when I was younger. Quiet does not mean empty. It means respected. The steel in the ground did not need to argue. The county records did not need to raise their voice. Everything that needed to be said had already been stamped, measured, and set 3 feet below the surface. And under a wide Texas sky that does not belong to any association, my ranch stood exactly where it always had, solid and unshared, not because I fought louder, but because I built deeper.